Okay, camera one rolling.
Speed on B.
Okay,
Jim Stockdale interview, take 2.
great. You grew taller since I last. Let me just adjust this a little bit.
How's the oil count?
Good. Thank you.
All right, you look great. Get my glasses off. Okay. To get inside the story of your father and his remarkable performance, his remarkable courage, resilience. I mean, the accolades go on and on and on.
All that stuff, yeah.
We need to understand a bit about what made up your father. He went through a graduate program in philosophical studies, is that correct?
It was international relations. He voluntarily went over to the philosophy quad and asked to be tutored in some aspects of ancient philosophy.
During his time there, he was significantly impacted by Epictetus. Was he a Stoic? Was Epictetus a Stoic?
Epictetus was a Stoic. If I may, Dad had finished his master's thesis, and he was finished with the formal expectations for the master's degree that the Navy had sent him to Stanford to receive. He had some time, and he wandered over to the part of the quad, as they call it at Stanford, to the philosophy department, and he was going through the hall when he heard a voice out of an office say, "May I help you?" The gentleman who had asked was Philip Rhinelander, senior professor of philosophy at Stanford, and he and Dad struck up a quick conversation and friendship. Rhinelander had been in the Navy as a young man and then had pursued academics for the remainder of his life and written extensively. Philip Rhinelander had a course entitled The Problems of Good and Evil. Dad had missed the first part of the course, but Rhinelander volunteered to tutor him to get him through the material in the first half so Dad could attend the second half of the course in the 3 months that remained before he was going to go on assignment, in essence, back on the line for the Navy. After Dad had completed the course and he and Rhinelander were having a visit and saying goodbye, Phil Rhinelander went over to his bookshelf and pulled out a very thin copy of The Enchiridion by Epictetus and said, "You're a military man. These are words that may help you as you go forward." Dad took the manual is really the translation. Dad took the booklet and read it over as the weeks ensued, and he and our family drove down to San Diego for his next duty assignment, and he thought to himself initially, "Old Rhinelander must be losing it. This philosopher's talking about things that really don't have much value for me as a modern man. I play golf, I drink martinis, I go to parties. I'm modern, and these elements that he's describing are ancient." Dad would, of course, later enter into the equivalent of an ancient civilization and need every bit of the Epictetus that he had committed to memory, every bit of the Stoical philosophy that could help him and get him through very difficult times of solitary confinement and occasional torture.
To distill Epictetus's teachings, one of the things that I took away from it was that there is that in the world that you can control. And this became an amazing evolution for your dad.
Yes.
He actually, in his own words, found his goodness, his soul in this experience.
Yes.
Prison. And then there is that which you cannot control. And and I want to encapsulate that essence because it
Yes.
figures largely into the way he led his men.
Yes.
And the way he helped them understand their successes and their failures and where they could succeed and where they failed. So if you can, put that into a germ that we can use later in the...
When asked about Epictetus's teachings, Dad would say that it focused on the separation of what is under our control as human beings and what is not. He would quote Epictetus in saying, an injury to the leg is an impediment to the well, sorry. Dad would say that an injury was an impediment to the leg, but not to the will, and that in spite of dreadful circumstances physically, you still had control over your mind and what you would volunteer and what you would be able to do. He realized that the life of the mind, the internal mind, was key to his survival and the survival of the men around him. That knowing what you have control over and what you do not have control over is essential. In other words, it's not what they do to you, it's what you do with what they do to you.
Well done, well done. Your father would quote Solzhenitsyn. Tell me about what he found about good and evil. Let's try to put that in perspective.
Well, Dad would later read Solzhenitsyn, and Solzhenitsyn had been imprisoned in the archipelago, which was a prison system for dissidents in the Soviet Union. Solzhenitsyn at one point said that, well, he thanked God for putting prison in his life because it was in those most desperate stirrings as he laid in the rotted straw in the gulag that he truly found he knew the difference between beauty and hatefulness. There are different translations for this, of course, but Solzhenitsyn operated and understood that the presence of prison in his life gave him a sense of perspective that he otherwise would never have, and that it was an experience to be cherished later in life and not forgotten.
And that dividing line between the world of, or if we can.
Sure. Solzhenitsyn further said as he went on that he discovered that the line between good and evil was not a line between countries, it was not a line between men or races or creeds, but it was a line in every man, that the line between good and evil flowed across the heart. Shit. When I repeat things that Dad repeated, I'm sorry, that just... Solzhenitsyn said that the line between good and evil went across every human heart, and that the choices we made daily made the difference between whether we were good or we were contributing to the darkness in the world.
Beautiful, Jim.
So good.
Tell me, if you can, in your understanding and conversations you had after your father's return, how in the darkness of the many, many years, months, hours of the incredible torment and pain that he went through, of the challenges that he faced as a leader, how those words strengthened him and gave him purpose.
I think Dad's study of philosophy and reading deep thinkers and men who had experienced the bone-chilling terror of political prisons gave him a sense of appreciation for what he would need to do in order to lead men under these difficult circumstances. He understood that his men would need to withstand brutal torture and ongoing pain from broken limbs that went unattended and from different aspects of malnutrition that took hold, worms, and different diseases that would envelop them over time. So he strived to give them orders, or make policy in modern jargon, that would help them make good choices, both as in the responsibility they had as military men, but also to one another as a community. Dad realized early on that if these men were going to survive this circumstance, it would be because of their loyalty to one another and not because of patriotic slogans. He understood that the deep love and affection that these men developed for one another was in fact the power that would enable them to come home with their heads raised high. You want me to go a different angle with that?
No, that's fantastic. We'll go into that a little bit more.
Okay, all right. Is this better?
This is fantastic.
Okay, all right.
This is really the heart of it.
I'm trying to help it feel better.
Yeah, no, it's
All right.
because we can't understand your father without understanding the things that he clung to and found and formed as the rock bed of who he was.
Mhm.
There was, and let's say it on camera, because your father likes, and I'm sorry, I'm pronouncing it wrong, is it Solzhenitsyn?
I've always heard it, and Dad pronounced it Solz, Sasohlz, Solzhenitsyn.
Solzhenitsyn. Like Solzhenitsyn.
It's okay.
I'm gonna do a Trumpism here, like Solzhenitsyn, your father, no one could guess that he would say, I'm glad that this happened to me. I'm glad that I was shot down, I'm glad I'm away from my family, or I would wanna go through that again. But he did, there was a way in which he understood that he was not resentful of it. In his terms of his moral and ethical and spiritual development,
Mhm.
he was grateful
Yeah.
to be a man who had come to his self-understanding through this experience. And can you phrase that in your own words in a way that, or in words that your father said?
Do my best, yeah. The relationships that Dad was able to construct with his fellow prisoners and the deep sense of community that remained implicit in the orders that he gave his men allowed him to see men at their very best. After he returned home, much to my mother's chagrin, Dad would say in talks that he was never more happy in his life than during some of the times that he had spent in prison, because he was able to see humankind at its very best, at its most affectionate, loving, and caring, under the most difficult circumstances, men caring for one another. Dad's first set of orders to his men, and these had to be very concise because they were tapped through walls rather than spoken, was an acronym, BACK US. B stood for do not bow in public. A stood for stay off the air, don't read on the radio. This for various reasons. C, for reasons of legality, admit no C, crimes. And K stood for we do not kiss the enemy goodbye. No one goes home early, we all go home together. Now these were orders from the senior naval prisoner in prison. But BAC was followed by US, and people always assume that that stands for the United States. Instead, it stood for unity. Instead, it stood for unity over self. And that commitment to community enabled the men under his command to build and keep relationships that they would savor for the rest of their natural lives. Is that, we want to do some more stuff?
That was stellar, fantastic.
Okay.
It is the essence of any leader of tomorrow who listens to that is going to take away something from your father and from you. Thank you.
Yeah, okay.
The back US, well, I want to backtrack a little bit here. Your father received the Medal of Honor, correct?
Mm-hmm.
He's one of the few people whose there was a point and a story that he tells of during the time when he was incarcerated with the Alcatraz 11, that there was very little communication. He often went on for long, long times. It was the anniversary of, it was a 3-year anniversary of him being shot down and being taken to the thing, and a certain event happened through the walls. Do you know the story I'm talking about?
Sure.
Okay. And paraphrase it by the medals that your father received and the accolades and coming back, and then, but also, I want to get at this story of the friendships and what it meant in the bonds between these men.
Okay. Dad received several honors when he returned from prison, the Medal of Honor, and several other personal combat decorations. But I don't think he was ever honored as much in that experience than he was at the 3-year mark of his captivity, when he was in a little prison for very difficult American dissidents, the most obdurate and obstinate toward their Vietnamese captors that they could find. In isolation, these men were kept under especially primitive circumstances and in leg irons for 14 to 16 hours a day. On this 3-year anniversary, Dad didn't expect anything to happen, but someone who was out in the courtyard at one point and was taking a towel down off of the clothesline, kind of a dirty towel, snapped it in the air as if to dry it, and he was snapping tap code that said, "GBU JS, we are with you. GBU JS, we are with you all the way. We love you." And snapped a towel, and in tap code sent the letters GBU JS, we are with you all the way, with love. GBU stands for God bless you, JS for Jim Stockdale, and we are, just the letter R, with you, meant just that they would follow him and follow his orders as he directed them in those sweltering cells for 1.5 to 2 years.
And your father later said of this event,
Help me out.
he later said of this event that it meant
Sorry.
more to him than any medal
Oh,
he
yeah,
ever
I'm
received.
sorry, I thought, yeah, I should have, okay.
Yeah.
And I'm assuming you can cut and pick up because I'm trying to stay still. Later, he would remark that of all the medals and of all the commendations he received, he treasured nothing more than that moment when his men voluntarily told him that they were with him in the midst of the most difficult times of their lives and that they would follow him as far as he was willing to take them.
I believe it was Orson Swindle who was early on, had a despairing moment. I believe, do you know the story I'm talking about? He could hear, they were discussing across from underneath the cell doors, he and someone else, I believe it was Orson Swindle. And he said, I'll ask the old man
Yeah.
if they had heard your dad be brought into this.
Yeah.
And you know the story about later when your dad actually, when they met in the courtyard, Orson went up to him and said, that night you kept me together, and your father, you know this?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think I know the outline of it. I'll try.
I'm trying to get
Is
at
there
the
a-
ways that your father also evolved and was held together by his men as much as he also held them together.
Yes, okay. Let me try to get there with,
Because we're on that point right now with
Yeah.
this Medal of Honor and everything else.
yeah, yeah. At one point, after Dad had been through a particularly difficult quiz is what they called a torture session, he was taken back to a cell block and thrown into a cell, more or less in a heap, that was down the hall, if you can call it a hallway, from 4 or 5 other cells in which men were isolated. And the men at that point were whispering under the doorway, and they were talking about what they could the ways they could hope to challenge the enemy and things that they could do in order to sustain their self-respect under these difficult circumstances. At one point, Orson Swindle whispered, "Just a minute, let me ask the old man." And Dad overheard this, but didn't realize that he was the one they were referring to as the old man. He had no idea until Orson for a second time whispered under the door, "We need guidance, we need leadership, what can you provide?" Dad realized then that he was the old man that they were referring to, and that it was going to be his responsibility to try and help guide these men through this experience. One of the mistakes that was made early by others in the prison was to tell men, "Do your best." Dad quickly discovered that would not do. These men said, "No, we cannot just do our best and expect that to be enough. You need to tell us what we can tell the enemy. You need to tell us what to take torture for. You need to tell us how far we can go in order and still preserve our dignity and our self-respect." That was a lesson that Dad learned that night as he started to whisper to Orson under the door, and he began to form in his mind ideas that might help his men survive with some shred of self-respect as they went through the prison ordeals over and again.
And as I recall the story, it was a particularly dark time for your dad in that cell. Your dad, we want to see where the cracks were for your dad too. There were times
Sure.
when he wanted to give up. And
Oh,
that
yeah.
was one of those nights. And it was something about, because what would happen in the way I had heard the story was that Orson, years later, when they
Yeah,
were.
sorry, I forgot that.
Yeah, okay.
Okay, all right, sorry about that. Apologize.
You see what I'm trying to.
I do.
I'm going to see the human in your father, not
Mhm.
the Superman, the guy who.
No, right. Years later, as Dad was in a courtyard and the men were permitted to see one another and were living together, Orson approached Dad and the two of them talked. There were occasions during the first phases of this living together that men saw others who they had communicated with through tap code for years and never seen their faces. But Orson approached Dad and reminded him of that night, that difficult night. And Dad told Orson how much he appreciated being contacted and how he realized at the real depths of his despair that he had a duty to others, and that in some ways Orson giving Dad that opportunity rescued Dad from a deep depression and a sense of despair that he had after having been brutalized terribly over a long period of time and then left in what they called a cold soak in leg irons in a section of the prison they called heartbreak. Dad was in very difficult shape that night, and he credited Orson asking for his guidance as having brought him through that very difficult time.
And I will get Orson's account of this as
Okay.
well, which is
Yeah.
great.
He may or may not remember it. That's okay.
One of the things that's important is Orson was ready to give up that night, and when he called out to your father's words helped him to keep going, and he wanted to go thank your dad for helping him keep him going, and your dad turned it around and said, "I would need you to understand that night
Yeah.
was equally dark for me, and it was you calling out to me, actually, that helped me to get." And that's a really powerful thing, because one of the things that I want to develop here, Jim.
Sure, is a synergy and right.
And also that
Back to
leaders
back.
are not just born supermen, they're called, and
Yes.
they rise to that call. Your father rose to that call. Okay.
Do you want me to do that?
Yeah.
You want me to try to do that?
Yeah.
Okay. When Orson approached Dad, he realized in that moment how much that had meant to him, and he remembered that in the depths of his own despair, in the depressing and difficult circumstances, as he lay on the floor, soaked with the urine of a prior prisoner, that when Orson called out to him, that he felt as though he was being rescued as well, that Dad was being asked by junior officers to provide them with the leadership that they needed. And that so reinvigorated Dad's sense of duty, his calling as a leader, as a father figure for young officers, and as someone who could try to make sense of their world, that he too had responsibilities. And that awakened in him, revitalized a spirit of leadership and of responsibility and of the many duties he carried as a leader of men through that difficult time.
Beautiful, Jim. Beautiful.
Working on it.
Okay, so now let's move on to the code of conduct and the conundrum facing the POWs. And the
That's a
step
hard one.
that your father took, because in effect, he rewrote the code of conduct. And
Yeah.
there was a lot of military risk in that, as well as moral risk and everything else.
Yeah.
Okay.
Where to start?
Let's start with the idea of how many people broke. And what,
Okay.
look, the code of conduct states this, but
Okay.
what in point of fact, the
Okay,
reality of it.
let me do something and then, okay, we'll
Okay.
get to that. Okay, so, another instance in which Dad was in a cell and felt the burden of responsibility was when he was with other men and other pilots were brought down. They were taken into the heartbreak section of Wallow, and they were tortured and beaten for the first time and then put in leg irons and put on what they called a cold soak. They were kept in solitary confinement, never seeing and never hearing the voice of another American for weeks, sometimes months. And after this period, they were softened up again and then thrown into a more general population, which consisted of 6 or 8 cells, 4 men perhaps on one end of the corridor and the one man way down at the end. At this point, the experienced prisoners would say, "Hey, new guy," under the door. They would whisper as loudly as they could, "New guy, tell us your name and tell us what you've been through." Often this would be followed by silence. The shame that the aviator felt for having been broken under pressure was particularly oppressive. But they would sustain their calls out to him to get his name and to hear about what he had been through. Finally, a prisoner would come under the door and he would say, "You don't want to know who I am and I don't want to tell you. You don't want to have anything to do with me because I've broken the code of conduct and I've told the enemy things that I shouldn't have, and I've been tortured into submission, and I've been weak, and I haven't been able to hold up what I know to have been my professional end of the bargain." And at that point, Dad would whisper under the door and say, "Listen, there are no virgins in here. We have all been through what you have been through. Welcome to the club. You need to tell us what you went through, what questions they asked, so that we can better plan our defensive strategy, so that we can know what is coming, and so we can all be together in a community. You are one of us, and never think anything else. You are one of us, and you must never think otherwise. You should know that you're welcome here and that we need to know your story." And then they would elicit from the new prisoner the details of his confinement and what questions in particular he was being asked. Often these had to do with superficial elements of the conduct of an aircraft carrier off the coast, items of military importance that were minimal at best, but they were still military questions that the man had succumbed to answering after several hours of brutal pain. In this way, Dad and others created a community. And this community of confession, this community of brothers who had all been broken, was the very strength that enabled so many of them to come home, so many of them to come home whole, to feel a sense of dignity and pride that they thought they had lost when they were first thrown into the cell, and when they first thought that they had dishonored their country, only to realize that they were part of a very brave platoon of men who had all been put through the same treatment and who had been broken. Being broken involved the code of conduct, which said, in essence, or the understanding with which these men were shot down, was that you could give name, rank, serial number, and date of birth only to the enemy if you were interrogated, that to volunteer more information was in many ways dishonorable, and you certainly weren't to give any military facts of any measure to the enemy upon questioning. The code of conduct did not work in these circumstances, and Dad essentially rewrote the code of conduct to stress communication, realizing that all men who were going to go through the ropes, as they called it, the rope torture, were going to at some point be forced to say, "I submit," and in some way write or say things that they would otherwise never say or write. The code of conduct needed to be rewritten in this instance because it did not work at all for the very men who were fighting against these forces. At one point, after Dad had come home on the patio of our home in Coronado, he and I were out, and he'd been home for a couple of weeks, and he remarked that he just could never have anticipated the wonderful, warm welcome that he felt, and how proud he was of his family, and how proud he was of his men, and that he could never, ever have imagined that he would be this happy and this well taken care of again. He said, "You know, there was a time when I was afraid that having rewritten the code of conduct for our experience, I would come home in disgrace, and that I might at some point be discharged from the service without honor, that I would undergo a court-martial and would in some way be disgraced. But I figured at that time that if that were the case, that one or two of my boys and I could go out to our old farm in Illinois and dig out a living if, in fact, that was what happened. And it was worth it to lead those men through that, even if it meant that I would later be taken out of the Navy in dishonor." That, of course, was an unnecessary worry, but it was one of the feelings that occurred to him in the prison.
Although, was there not someone in the government who took particular umbrage with your father rewriting the code and was trying to pursue at least or stir up some kind of trouble? Wasn't there? Was it you who told me that, or?
I'm sure that we're not on for this. There was a stirring about that. Maybe you're thinking, Patrick, of the fact that 20 years later he and Mom wrote the story about the Gulf of Tonkin, and at the time
I think you're right.
Casey was the chief of the CIA and threatened to bring, the court-martial is what's echoing there, because Casey threatened to bring him back to active duty and court-martial him for betraying secrets.
We'll let that go then.
All right.
Okay, so
Heroic guy gets to deal with that.
just as so that we get it on tape, because now
Sure.
it's probably let's tell the story of Slam Marshall. And also, when you tell it, just in your own words, try to bring us to what that must have meant for your dad, because there was some part of him that had to, he took the true act of leadership. He was on the ground and he cared for his men in a way that the laws could not. So,
Sure. Yeah.
But even so, coming back, there was some part of him that was still wondering, am I going to be discharged, all this stuff. So there's still pain in that he had to go it alone and take the consequences for it. So when Slam Marshall told him this, it had to have yet another layer of like, so,
Right, relief.
Yes.
Years later, Dad was at a conference at the Army War College in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, and there was assembled quite a number of distinguished officers from all branches of the military. And during the social hour preceding the main banquet, a gentleman who was also to be seated at the main dais walked up to Dad and said, "Admiral, my name is Slam Marshall, and I'm wondering if I can sit next to you tonight at dinner." Dad recognized his name, but had to kind of put some things together, but he said, "Of course, sure." They're welcome having some time with him. At the dinner, Slam, or S.L.A. Marshall, who had been a friend of Eisenhower's and a fellow Army officer, said to Dad, "How'd you do with that code of conduct over there in prison?" And Dad said, "Well, not very well. That was very difficult, and at one point I was apprehensive that I had countered that order and told my men to respond in ways that were different than the code of conduct dictated." And Slam said, "You know, that's the darndest thing." He said, "Ike asked me to put together a panel of people, and we're the ones who generated the text for the code of conduct. And the original text in our form said that a prisoner, when taken prisoner, someone could give name, rank, serial number, and date of birth. And the essence of the code was, after that, it's up to you. After that, you have to take some measure of the situation." And what Slam Marshall wanted Dad to know was, after he had finished it and it had been approved by Eisenhower, it was sent to the Pentagon and underwent bureaucratic revision and editing, where men who may or may not be called into hard combat duty rewrote it to be restrictive, to say only name, rank, serial number, and date of birth, and specifying that anything additional would be against the code of conduct. Dad found that encounter to be incredibly relieving, because he knew, he had known in his heart all along that what he had done was to give his men orders to live by. But here he was finding out that the original author of the code of conduct not only agreed with him, but that it had been written in the spirit that Dad had implemented, as opposed to the more restrictive and punitive interpretation that later accompanied men into battle.
Circling back now, if we can, let's go back to Epictetus, not necessarily quoting him in name, but in the Solzhenitsyn moment.
Mm-hmm.
In essence, Slam Marshall is in this moment affirming to your father that there is, that the delineation between good and evil that passes through every heart, that one must discover on their own and follow. In essence, we say it, follow your heart, or follow your soul, or follow your instincts. But your father in this moment had corroboration of a higher value of leadership than someone can write down in a text. Can you paraphrase that?
Try and get that together? Okay. Following his discussion with Slam Marshall, and reflecting upon it, Dad realized that Slam, in the original interpretation of the Code of Conduct, had said something very similar to what Solzhenitsyn had said, that it is up to you, that after a time, the line between good and evil in every human heart and the orders with which a man goes into battle might find themselves in conflict, and that following what is in your men's best interest and in your instinct, in your sense of the moment, you give them orders that help them survive honorably under the circumstances, prevailed over a rule book that someone may have come up with and written down for everyone in advance. There are times, in battle especially, when men need to make the call between something restrictive and something that is trusting. And Dad chose to trust his men rather than order them to do something he knew would be impossible.
Fantastic.
Is that all right?
Fantastic. Oh, that was brilliant.
Working on it.
All right. Now, I mean, there's so much here that's, I mean, I could honestly keep you on camera for about the next couple of days. All right, we done? All right, the top.
There's one little hair that's
You wanna cut for a second then? Let's cut for a second.
Okay.